At the end of part 4, we came to what I call the Great Fracture. The old houses divided, families scattered across Europe. They claimed new lands, built new homes, formed new alliances, and took new names. As the generations passed, they began marrying into one another. The old houses' names slowly disappeared, but the blood didn't. That's the important part of this. Names change, but blood doesn't. And as I've said before, blood remembers. So from this point forward, we're not going to follow the names. We're going to follow the blood. And following the blood brings us into the great dynasties of Europe. Because the Great Fracture didn't end the 13 houses, it scattered them. Sons moved into new territories, daughters married into other families, and enemies became allies. And sometimes the easiest way to end a fight over land wasn't another war, it was marriage. Think about what that does after a few hundred years. One bloodline crosses with another, their children marry into another, then another, and the names keep changing. But the bloodlines begin coming back together. The Great Fracture separated the houses, but marriage brought the blood back together. And somewhere along the way, the old names disappeared from almost completely. European houses, royal families, noble families. Families connected by marriage, inheritance, land, wealth, and power. And that's where somebody we've already talked about enters the story. Vlad the Impaler, Dracula. Now remember when this series started, Cain, the first vampire. So I find it interesting that after following this bloodline for almost 10,000 years, we arrive at the man whose name would become forever connected, synonymous with vampires. But what if Vlad wasn't the beginning? What if Dracula was simply another name, another generation, another appearance of the bloodline? We asked that question earlier in the series, and now we're finally worked our way back to it. Vlad belonged to the European dynasty. He had a father and brothers and ancestors. And like so many ruling families of that period, his family didn't exist in isolation. European nobility married European nobility. Royal families married other royal families. Land changed hands, titles changed hands, and bloodlines crossed borders. Follow the marriages long enough, and you will find connections between families that, just by looking at their names, appear to have absolutely nothing to do with one another. And that's the whole point. Stop looking at the names. Follow the bloodline. Because eventually those dynastic lines lead forward later into European royal families. And those families marry into still other families. English, Scottish, German, French, Hungarian, Bavarian. Generation after generation, the web gets bigger. Until eventually we arrive at another period that's important in the story. The age of the Illuminati. Now, the Illuminati didn't invent the bloodlines. They were the bloodline. Bloodlines thousands of years old. So maybe we're asking the wrong question again. Maybe the question isn't who created the Illuminati. Maybe it's who was the first one. Because organizations have names too. And just like family names, organizations can change. They can disappear. They can reappear. And they can become something else entirely. But the families behind them can continue. And eventually, conspiracy researchers started talking about 13 particular bloodlines, 13 modern families. And that's where this gets interesting, because we started with 13 houses. Now, 10,000 years later, we're looking at 13 bloodlines again. Coincidence? Maybe. But let's look at what happened. According to the modern conspiracy writers, there are 13 bloodlines that keep appearing in the story. Astor, Bundy, Collins, DuPont, Freeman, Kennedy, Lee, Onassis, Rockefeller, Rothschild, Russell, Van Dyne, and the Margolin bloodline. I mispronounced it, sorry. 13 names. Now, I'm not telling you that I can take a piece of paper and draw A straight genealogical line from every one of those families all the way back to Cain, because nobody can. There are too many missing records, too many wars, too many kingdoms that disappeared, and too many libraries that were burned. Too many families that changed their names, and that's exactly the point. We're still looking for names. Maybe we shouldn't. Go back to the Great Fracture. 13 houses scattered. Sons established their own families. Daughters married into other houses. Brothers became enemies. Enemies became allies. And alliances became marriages. Every time that happened, the genealogy changed, but the blood did not disappear. It mixed, it crossed, and eventually it came back together. So what if these 13 modern names aren't separate bloodlines at all? What if they are simply the modern branches of something much, much older? Maybe Astor wasn't always Astor, Rockefeller wasn't always Rockefeller, and Rothschild wasn't always Rothschild. Maybe none of those families carried their current names 1,000 years ago, but why would they? The names aren't important, but the blood is. And that's when House Noden became important again. Remember what made Noden different, House Noden different. Noden wasn't necessarily the richest house, it wasn't necessarily the strongest, or the house commanding the largest army. Noden kept the records, the genealogy, who married whom, who fathered whom, which daughter married into which family, which son left and established another house, which branch disappeared under another name. Everyone else could forget, Noden could not, because somebody had to remember where the blood went. Blood always remembers. Now let's come forward again. Kings became governments, trading houses became corporations, gold became paper, and paper became numbers on a computer screen. Armies, borders, and countries change, and European dynasties don't hold that kind of power they once did. But power didn't disappear. It changed with the world. We've talked about this before. If you live long enough, money isn't the objective. Money is a tool. Land is a tool. Government and technology is a tool. The objective, the goal, is control. And maybe that's where we misunderstood the Illuminati story. People keep looking for a room. 13 people sitting around a table deciding what's going to happen tomorrow. Maybe there was never such a room. Maybe there didn't need to be. Maybe the Illuminati wasn't one organization controlling 13 bloodlines. Maybe the bloodlines were what people eventually started calling the Illuminati. Different families, different countries, different businesses, different governments. Sometimes allies, sometimes competitors, sometimes probably hating one another, just like the original 13 houses. But underneath of it all, the blood. And that's what brings us all the way back to where this series started. Cain, one man, one mark, one murder. What a ridiculous question. We asked that. What if Cain became the first vampire? Then we asked another. What if that mark didn't die with him? What if it passed through his descendants? Those descendants became families. Families became houses. Houses became dynasties. Dynasties fractured. The families scattered. And the names changed. And eventually the bloodlines found one another again. Cain became Nodden. Nodden became 13 houses. The 13 houses disappeared into European history. European dynasties became intertwined, and thousands of years later, we find 13 names again. Does this prove anything? Maybe. Maybe Dracula wasn't the first vampire. Maybe it was Cain. Maybe the Illuminati wasn't created in Bavaria. Maybe Bavaria was simply another chapter, and the 13 bloodlines aren't 13 families. Maybe they're 13 ancient bloodlines carrying modern names. I don't know. I don't think anyone does, except the families, and I don't think they're going to tell us. Kingdoms, empires, governments don't last. Even organizations don't last. Even family names don't necessarily last. But family has a way of always continuing, generation after generation after generation. So maybe history has been showing us the same families over and over again. We just didn't recognize them because we kept looking at their names. Names change, but blood doesn't. Blood remembers. Later, taters.
Attention passengers, we've now reached our destination. We hope you enjoyed the flight and have a nice day.